Now it's Mike Slater.
Morning, Slater. Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. San Diego's America's finest city. Do you remember the National Prayer Breakfast a couple years ago? I want to say, I think it was 2, but it may have been even longer than that. Dr. Ben Carson spoke and made some controversial comments about our medical system and Obamacare. The White House demanded an apology from him after that prayer breakfast because he dare stray into controversial terrain in a venue like this. And they felt that his comments showed disrespect to the president. Fast forward a couple of years, and you know by now what the president said the other day about Christianity. Let me read this again real quick. Lest we get on our high horse and think that this is unique to some other place. Remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow was all too often justified in the name of Christ. We broke that down a lot in a lot of different ways, but I wanted to bring in a great expert here. His name is Dr.Andrew Bostom, author of many books, including Legacy of Jihad and Sharia vs. Freedom. How are you, Doctor? Great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Really appreciate your time here, and I have some big questions that I hope we can at least start to chip away at. First, though, before we even get to those, I'm just curious your interest in this field of study. What's your background, and when did you decide to get involved in studying Sharia and Jihad and Islam?
My background is actually in medicine and clinical trials. I felt this was thrust upon me at the time of 9/11. Did my training in New York, so did my wife. We still had a lot of family down in New York. You know, we eventually moved up to Rhode Island after we did our training up here. And I was just appalled at the blatant apologetics. You know, you develop a good crack detector when you do clinical trials and medicine, and you're evaluating therapies. They work, they don't work, they harm people, they help people. You know, these are basic decisions you have to make based on openness and candor. And I was watching the information filter in after 9/11, and it just didn't fit right with me. And I just, kind of a compulsive person. One thing led to another, and I wound up getting heavily involved in doing research on the nature of jihad, as someone who's a Jew, on Islamic anti-Semitism. I couldn't understand some of the crazy kinds of hateful things that were constantly being uttered, and Jews being blamed, and then ultimately got very interested in the Sharia itself. So,
wow. Great. No,
it's been a process of about 13 years now.
Wonderful. All right, so let me walk you through a couple things and let me give you the big question that I want to ask, and then you can help me walk through my train of thought. The ultimate question I want to start to break down is Islam a religion of peace? Right? We hear it over and over again.
Not.
Okay, let me lead you this way, and you can help me understand this. So, I'm a Christian, and people against Christianity will point to things in the Old Testament that are brutal, right? And Christians will say, that's Old Testament. Those things don't apply anymore. And then an atheist or whatever will say, well, look, it's Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So to an untrained eye, they'll say, well, that means it's even worse than what was in the Old Testament, right? Jesus says if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. I mean, look at that man. He's crazy. He's cutting off hands and ripping out eyeballs. Now, as a Christian, I know that Jesus is not being literal here, right? He's saying if you have a problem with lust, don't go to the strip club. If you're an alcoholic, don't go to the bar. If you have a tendency to be lazy, don't sit on the couch first thing when you get home. Point is, when you study the Bible, these things become clear. I've never studied the Quran, so when I read a part of it that says, and you can quote this better than I, that you shouldn't even be friends with an infidel, that sounds evil and horrible, but is that just because I don't know the full backstory and context, or is that really what it says?
No, it's actually quite straightforward. But just to backtrack a bit, the Old Testament and the New Testament have now some thousands of years of commentary, of exegesis, and also practice. particularly the very violent, descriptive parts of the Old Testament, like the book of Joshua describing, the conquest of Canaan. These are completely contextualized, descriptive texts. The Quran is not like that. It's prescriptive. It's eternal directives that are valid now as they were when they were allegedly revealed. If you believe in this process, and that's a profound difference, Mike. And in terms of the Quranic commentaries, how they clarify things, if anything, they make some of the ambiguous or ambiguous-sounding contents of the Quran more bellicose and more hateful. So I think there's a yawning gap doctrinally. I'm not talking about behaviors of individual Christian kingdoms, etc. I'm talking about doctrine. Doctrinally, the Quran and the New Testament and the Old Testament are profoundly different. And so when you look at the way the Quran is constructed, it's not in a logical progression. In other words, the first chapter to the 114th chapter, they're called surahs. The Quran is constructed in a way where it's longest to shortest, with the exception of this first surah. So the second surah to the 114th surah, it's literally longest to shortest. So then you have to begin to look at how Muslims believed that things were revealed chronologically. It turns out the 9th surah is the last surah. Well, unfortunately, Mike, that final revelation is a chapter of war proclamation, timeless war proclamations against real peoples, against pagans, i.e. Hindus, Buddhists, animists, against Jews and Christians, against Zoroastrians. So it's a very, very different kind of framework. And moreover, the Muslim jurists, the legists, over the centuries, from the advent of Islam, certainly through the first 500 years, constructed the Quranic doctrine, the Quranic dictates, with additional materials that come from the life of Muhammad, whether they're early Muslim biographies of him or the so-called traditions that were collected. The traditions called the Hadith are very much like the Gospels. They're the recollections of his first converts. And those materials incorporated, the Quran, the Hadith, the Seerah, the early biographies, form the corpus of the Sharia, the law itself. And there, when you study the law of jihad, oh my goodness, it is eminently clear that it is a timeless war doctrine to basically subjugate all of humanity to Islam and to Islamic law.
Okay, so so much going on there. Awesome stuff. That's why we had you on, Doctor. So if I can summarize this in the sentence so far, you have Old Testament warfare, very specific to that time, to that moment, to that specific purpose. But Quran, how would you say, violence from now to the future. So warfare, how do you say
Open-ended.
that? Open-ended. Okay. All right. That's very, very important. And you also brought up I never knew that the Quran, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Quran longest to shortest, not chronological.
So in other words, there's something called the Fatiha, the opening surah, which was sort of spatchcocked onto the beginning. That's the first surah or chapter. Chapters 2 to 114 are literally longest to shortest, and that's why to the novice it's a little haphazard and rambling until you begin to look at how Muslims are taught to read the Quran, which is in terms of revelation. In other words, which of these surahs was revealed before the next, etc. And when you look at that ordering, then a picture begins to take shape of Muhammad initially being a proselytizer and moving on to where he basically becomes a warlord and conqueror. And that's the final revelation.
Interesting. So it's funny. I was talking to a buddy the other day. He's been to Middle East a couple different times in his profession. And he was trying to explain to me, and he's done this a couple times, and I can't quite comprehend it, that we in America, in the West, we think chronologically, but the Middle East and Islam, they think circularly. So he'll have a conversation with someone in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever, and they don't think in terms of time like we do. Like like 2 days ago isn't a concept. They don't have birthdays over there. Everyone's document, they're either born on January 1st or December 31st of the year. So like they don't even really know how old they are. Things were done. Hey, have you ever been to this location? Yeah, I've been there. Yeah. When were you there? I've been there. There's no concept of time. And that's interesting because that may sort of be in the Quran you're saying as well. It's not chronological, it's more circular.
Well, it's just that it's a little, there is a circular quality to it. But the ordering is not as straightforward as one might think or one might wish or one might assume. And, this is going to be dependent on the scholars of these materials, the Muslim scholars of these materials, who have been forced to organize it in a way which allegedly claims that this verse was revealed before this verse, even though chronologically it could come after it.
Weird, but you're saying the main thing is the last thing that happened, even though it's sort of in the middle or the beginning. That's the most important for us to realize.
Well, what I'm saying specifically is that Surah 9 or Chapter 9 is believed by Muslims to be the final revelation of the Quran, and it is a chapter of timeless war proclamation.
Can I read a verse right here? So when the sacred months have passed away, then slay the idolaters wherever you find them, take them captive.
Yeah, that's Quran 9:5.
Yep.
That's the fifth verse.
Lie in wait for them in every ambush. Then if they repent and keep up prayer and pay the poor rate, leave their way free to them.
This is the open-ended war proclamation on pagans, or what we would consider, and they were beset by the Muslim armies, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and then the animists. The animists, of course, might even include the pagans of the Arabian Peninsula itself. But these are real people. These are not long extinct peoples from the Old Testament. And then if you get to verse 929, if you happen to have the Quran in front of you, you'll see the timeless war proclamation against Jews and Christians, so-called people of the book.
Yeah. And then the jizya, there it is.
They are to be humbled. In other words, they have a choice. They can submit to the Muslim armies and become part of the Islamic State and live under the Sharia and be subjected to certain rather humiliating regulations and also pay the burden of the taxes for the society. But at least their lives are spared. They pay a tax called the jizya, the poll tax. And if you look at the etymology of the word jizya, it literally means the tax paid in lieu of being slain.
Whoa!
So they have the choice to submit.
Doctor, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt. I got to do a TV hit really quick right now. Can you stick around for another segment and we can continue this?
Sure.
But wonderful. Dr. Andrew Bostom is who we're talking about, legacy of jihad and Sharia versus freedom. And this is the question I want to ask next to ultimately get to. If this is what the Quran says, and there's a Muslim living down the street, and they're not killing people, are they bad Muslims or not fulfilling what their faith tells them to do? Like, what is? I'm trying to understand what that means. So we're going to talk with the good doctor coming up next. If you have a question, 1-800-760-KFMB. Mike Slater Show. Spread the word. Dead Air Dan. There he is, ladies and gentlemen. That was my fault. We'll tell you about Anchor Funding. Could $150 help you? How about $150 every month for many years, or $250 every month? Or if you're not excited, just $300, $400 every month for every month of the year for many years. Average 15-year mortgage rates are in the 2s, and average 30-year home loans are in the 3s. Please put your home to work for you. Call my mortgage man, Kevin Lyons, president of Anchor Funding. You can lower your monthly payments, free up some extra cash. Kevin helped some listeners just the other day, because of these crazy low rates and increased property values, $155 a month with a no points, no fees refinance. And we talked to Kevin the other day. He had someone refinance and save about that much money, and they just refinanced a year ago. So even if you've done this recently, you can still call Kevin, save a ton of money. And if you haven't done it ever or in a very long time, then goodness gracious, you're wasting money. Call Kevin, 1-800-333-5157. Anchor Funding, San Diego-based direct lender. Been doing it for the last 16 years. There's literally, if you own a home, there's no reason not to call Kevin and spend 5 minutes and find out how much he can save you. You're going to spend 8 minutes plus today making money, 8 hours plus today, let's spend 5 minutes saving it. 1-800-333-5157, anchorfunding.net.
Equal housing lender, BRE number 01276087, NMLS 236419. Not all applicants qualify. Loans made or arranged pursuant to the Department of Business Oversight, California Finance Lenders Law.
Slater Crusaders, we're talking with Dr. Andrew Bostom. He is author of Legacy of Jihad and Sharia vs. Freedom. Nice enough to stick around for another segment here. And, sir, I apologize. I had to cut you off in the middle of your thought there. But we were talking about Quran 9:29. And if I could just read it here, and you can break down a couple of these words here. So, again, you're saying 9. This is the most important of all the Quran. Because why again?
Well, it's believed by Muslims to be the final surah chapter that was revealed, in the Quranic revelation process, and it is really, as you can see from the language, largely a series of war proclamations that are unfortunately timeless.
So this is the ... of the Quran that you must continue if you are truly a follower of it. Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden, which hath been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. There's a lot there, Doctor. Unpack this for us.
So basically what it's saying is that the people of the book, first of all, are generally believed to be Jews and Christians. The books that they have are the Old and New Testament. The Zoroastrians, who were the Persian civilization that were conquered in the first wave of Islamic conquest, were sort of granted this people of the book status, so it applies to them as well. And what it's saying is that they can submit again to Islamic law and become these sort of outcast pariahs in Islamic society that are not citizens but are really more like vassals, and be subjected to what are very discriminating regulations vis-a-vis the Sharia Islamic law, and pay these large taxes for that status.
That's the jizya.
Which the jizya, and that's the poll tax. And again, the etymology is the tax paid in lieu of being slain. Or of course they can fight and be slain and massacred, pillaged, and enslaved. Or they can convert to Islam, and then they become, although de facto it wasn't exactly equal, but over time they can become equal to the Muslim citizens of the state.
Interesting. The fact that the etymology of the word jizya means tax in lieu of being slain proves that slain is the default. That is the first priority. And then if you don't want to be slain, you pay the jizya. It's not if you don't pay the jizya, you're slain. It's you're slain unless you want to pay the jizya. Is that an act? There's a little bit of, it's a nuance, but that seems like an important.
Actually, no. It's very interesting. If you submit, or if you allegedly submit to Islamic law, and then you are not paying the jizya, often there were these very humiliating ceremonies for the jizya. There are actually these mock beheading ceremonies historically. But if the community is not paying the jizya and they're defiant about it, that can be grounds for resumption of the jihad.
Which means?
Well, which means war again.
You're slaughtered. Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
Let's talk about that word jihad. So, and I want to talk about deceit in here too, because I think this all ties together. But if you talk to someone about jihad, what it means, well, first of all, I think it was our national security. It was either the head of the CIA or the head of the national security agency.
Brennan.
Brennan, right? It's a personal religious journey. Then I've heard it described as a struggle, like an inner struggle. That's all a jihad is, Doctor.
The root of the word actually does mean struggle, but jihad fi sabilillah, struggle in the path of Allah, and it has come to be associated, certainly in the Quran. Depending on how you break it down, the root of the word jihad, jihada, appears in the Quran about 35 to 40 times. And in all but one or two instances, it's related to actual fighting, and so the again in the traditions of Muhammad, in other words, the sort of gospel-like pronouncements of his sayings, of his deeds, etc. There is a hadith which is from one of the more respected collections of these materials, which prioritizes the jihad, and jihad of the sword is first priority, jihad of the pen or propaganda is second priority. And yeah, if you're not willing or not brave enough to do either of those, then you can sort of have this more inner spiritual jihad. So it's really the lowest priority.
So again, jihad of the sword, jihad of the pen, you said?
Yeah, propaganda.
Wow. And then jihad of inner struggle.
Right.
Avoid
right.
sweets. So this is my ultimate.
I'll give you. No, actually, it's interesting. I'll give you an example.
Yep.
So Iran, which of course is known for the violent form of jihad warfare, funding global terrorism. Our State Department calls it the largest funder of global terrorism. Iran does in fact have a Department of Agricultural Jihad. But let's put it this way, Mike. When agriculture export becomes the main thing that Iran is known for, as opposed to jihad terrorism, then maybe indeed we can say that interpretation will have prevailed.
You're right. I'm looking at the Ministry of Jihadi Agriculture. What? What do they do there?
But in other words, it is saying that there's of course there's some validity to the idea of struggle, of striving.
Wow.
But again, it what apologists will do is say, well, it doesn't mean warfare at all, and of course that's nonsense.
Wow, fascinating. Okay, so I want to get to the $1 million question, and this is not fair because we only have a couple minutes. If you're willing to stay around, we can talk a little longer about it. Okay, so if someone, I'm going to go extreme here. If someone bombs an abortion clinic and yells, God is great, Jesus is great, God is great, long live Jesus, whatever, and does something horrible like that, Christians and everyone in every civilized person will rebuke that using the gospel about why that's the awfulest, most horrible thing you could do in the name of Jesus and God, right? So clearly that person's not living the Christian faith to its fullest, right? So that's so I guess what I'm trying to say is if you have a peaceful Muslim who lives down the street, and they have no interest in the sword or the pen, are they living the fullest of their Muslim faith?
Well, that's becoming an increasingly important question, because there even jihad of the pen is in fact nonviolent. And many forms of jihad, which again, the end goal of jihad is to Islamize the society, is to make it slowly, essentially a Sharia-based society, an Islamic law-based society. So it is not necessary to engage overtly in violence. There are many other means. Getting involved in politics with the end goal of altering our constitutional system so that it becomes a Sharia-compliant system is a perfectly valid form of jihad. On the other hand, you don't want to push this too far. There are certainly in Western societies there are Muslims that just practice purely pietistic aspects of Islam, have no interest in all the political aspects of Islam and can be integrated into our societies. The question whether they're really good Muslims or not is a very interesting question, and it's a difficult one. Thus far, through the present, they are not considered to be good Muslims, because a good Muslim will change his society so that it eventually becomes a Sharia-compliant society.
Which, and I want to talk about some polling coming up next, is happening certainly around the world and increasingly here
in the U.S., yeah. In the U.S., too.
Can you stick around, Doctor, for one more segment?
Sure.
Love to chat more. Actually, let me, can we go to David real quick? David, go ahead and ask your question, and we'll have the good doctor answer it just after the break. How are you, David?
All right.
Good.
I'm curious how it is we're able to separate the jihad Muslim from the regular Muslim when we don't separate the United States Army from Americans, or the Roman citizens from the Roman conquistors, or or anything like that, how is it that people would think that those pieces of the Quran directed at jihad is just not the mechanism for the Muslim faith generating an army? And once the army does its work, the Muslims move into the space created by that. What Muslim would deny Sharia law or not move into a space created by the jihadists, whether it's in Syria or in Western Europe?
So let me try to make sense. So you're suggesting there's a difference between a Muslim doing this versus a Muslim army doing this?
But no, I'm suggesting that the jihadist is the army wing of the Muslim faith. Not all Muslims are members of the army, but all benefit from the creation of areas that practice Sharia law.
Ooh, okay.
So the Quran is not as important as where do you put Sharia law in force.
Ooh, Doctor, this
Detroit
is
or wherever.
Doctor, do you know how to answer
why
that?
do we separate and make it so sterile?
Can you answer that question, Doctor?
The only objective way we can look at this, because I understand what the questioner is getting at, it is supposed to be an integrated whole. There's really no historical process analogous to what took place in the West, where there's a sharp demarcation of religion and state. So it makes this a very dicey question. The only objective way we can look at this is you mentioned, Mike, something about polling data. When we look at polling data about a very specific question, do you want the Sharia to be the law of the land? The numbers in Islamic societies that had some influence of the West, even Western colonialism. So if we look at the 5 most populous Sunni Muslim societies where Pew has polling data, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, and the Muslim majority of Nigeria, which is an enormous country, has a Muslim majority. If we look at those 5 populations, 77% want the Sharia to be the law of the land.
Not just in the army, but in the whole country. Sorry, Doctor, we have to take a break. We'll wrap that up, and I want to bring those questions down to America as well. We'll do that next. David, if you have a follow-up question, hang on the line. I'd love to chat more with you. 1-800-760-KFMB. I want to tell you about Zero Rez, author of Legacy of Jihad and Sharia versus Freedom. To everyone who's tuning in, because we said on the TV we're going to talk about welfare. We're going to do that tomorrow. So apologies for leading you astray, but I'm enjoying this conversation with the good doctor so much. I feel like we should continue it. Doctor, thank you for sticking around.
Sure.
So I talked to David a little bit off the air here, and I tried to get a little clearer understanding of what his question was. So if I can paraphrase, hopefully correctly, he said maybe not every Muslim in, let's just say, the Middle East is going to pick up guns and go kill the infidels. But if jihadis, right, so those who do, take over a territory, then the otherwise peaceful, previously peaceful Muslims will be happy to move into that now conquered territory and would be more than happy to force that area to live under Sharia law. So I believe his point is that we need to look at both, right? And perhaps the Sharia part is more important because that applies to more Muslims because they want that so strongly. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Well, just a couple of things. First, anecdotally, those that were brutalized by ISIS, the non-Muslims in particular, the Yazidis, the Christians in northern Iraq, there are a number of independent confirmatory reports that think about the numbers. It wasn't just the ISIS foreign fighters who were predatory against them when the time came. Tragically, it was in many cases their former Muslim neighbors who they had at least established a modus vivendi with over the years, who became impassioned, fanaticized, I guess we would say, with the influx of the hardcore ISIS jihadists, and caused many of the depredations that we witnessed and the tragedy that we saw unfold. So yes, there is this phenomenon, unfortunately. But on the broader question of living under the Sharia or wanting to live under the Sharia, as I said, we have strong metrics, including, curiously, and this was very disturbing to me, from Iran. I mean, one of the tropes that's out there is that, the Khomeini revolution, it was really a retrograde revolution, restored such a draconian form of the Sharia after at least a period of about 50 years of secularization, that eventually, when we saw this the so-called Green Movement, that it represented, in the summer of 2009, it represented a rejection of the Sharia. I was dubious of that, but regardless, we have polling data from Pew also, independently from Iran, and 83% of Iranians, despite this draconian imposition for the last 35 years of the Sharia, amputations, hanging homosexuals from cranes, stoning adulterers, brutally discriminating against non-Muslim minorities, forcibly hijabbing women. 83% still want the Sharia to be the law of the land.
I don't get that because there's TV commercials on YouTube that say, hey, that were aired in America, hey, fly on Air Iran and come in and check it out. It's a great, beautiful country. It's a westernized country. That wasn't only a couple decades ago.
Well, yes, yeah, but I'm just saying that was under a pretty autocratic, brutal imposition of forced Western secularization. I mean, so.
So that wasn't real. That was a prop.
Well, no, it was real. There was a minority. There's still a minority. After all, what's the flip side of 83%? 17% of 75 million people is not a trivial number of human beings, and it's tragic for them.
Yes.
But we have to look at these broader trends. The Sharia remains very popular, and it brings me to the United States, and this is my real concern. Around the time of the 2012 election, there was a poll taken of I think it was about 600 Muslims. It was based on generating a group of Muslims from trade lists. So it wasn't a random sample, but if anything, it was a sample biased towards higher socioeconomic status. So they would look at the last names and they would validate that the person was in fact a Muslim. It turned out that they were highly educated, successful financially, et cetera, et cetera. So again, not a random sample, but certainly a sample where you would expect the attitudes to be, if anything, more liberal, more westernized. It turns out that the basic question being asked was who they were going to vote for, and the poll was valid in that it turns out that Muslims voted significantly for Obama, and that was true in this sample. Then they asked a whole series of other attitudinal questions, which were really alarming. Not as bad as the Middle East, but alarming, because 58% admitted that that criticism of Islam and Islam's prophet Muhammad should not be allowed. So in other words, they don't like the First Amendment.
Let me interrupt, because that's interesting, because I don't want people to criticize Jesus, but you should be allowed to if you want.
Well, okay, but then they drilled down on this question. Then 46% actually said it should be criminally punished.
Yep.
12% were actually even willing to admit. Now, fortunately, that's a relatively small number, but not when you find out what the answer was. 12% admitted that yes, in fact, Islamic law penalty for blasphemy, full blown, which is death, should be applied. And they're talking about this country. 32% admitted that they felt, well, you know what, we're here, but we would actually like to see the Sharia eventually replace the U.S. Constitution as the government, as the law of the land.
Wow. Okay.
So those numbers are much smaller than the 77% you're getting from the five largest Sunni populations that Pew polled.
I know.
But I found that very alarming.
Sure. It should be 0. 60 seconds, Doctor. Give us the rundown. This is hard. Rundown on Sharia and what it means for the average man and woman who's driving around going to work right now.
It's very straightforward. It is a religious totalitarian system. Yes, of course, it includes pious aspects, that have to do with purification before you pray and things like that. But it's also intimately related to a political system. No freedom of speech, no freedom of conscience, punishments that we would consider dehumanizing, like amputation for theft, flogging for alcohol consumption, stoning for adultery. And it actually also includes the whole corpus of Islamic war theory and doctrine, i.e. jihad. That's all integrated into the Sharia.
Okay. At the very least, should we be calling for a separation of mosque and state?
Absolutely. It's critical. And look, and there are, whether they're actually secular or, and Muslims would probably consider them quote unquote apostates, or they're, sort of inner Muslims that really want to just deal with, certain inner spiritual aspects of what they see as the faith. There are advocates within Islamic societies for this, but But overwhelmingly, if 77% of the 5 largest populations that are Sunni Muslim want the Sharia, well, then they're certainly not abiding separation of church and state, of mosque and state.
Doctor, really great to talk to you. Can we do it again? Can we talk another time?
Sure.
Really enjoyed it. A Legacy of Jihad and Sharia versus Freedom. Those are his books, Dr. Andrew Bostom. Doctor, thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Thank you very much to Dr. Bostom, Bostom.